They sat in silence, strapped to a wooden chair, as thousands of volts surged through their bodies. America's most feared punishment. But these weren't men. These were women, mothers, wives, caretakers, turned cold-blooded killers. Their final moments weren't just about death. They were about justice, madness, and the eerie last words that still echo in history. Before we step into these haunting stories, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Join our growing true crime community and never miss a chilling tale from the shadows of history. Turn on the notification bell. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Martha M. Place, New York. In the winter of 1898, Martha Place committed one of the most unsettling crimes ever recorded in Brooklyn at the time. She attacked and murdered her 17-year-old stepdaughter, Ida Place, in what prosecutors and newspapers later described as a crime driven by jealousy, rage, and maternal resentment. Martha had married William W. Place, a widowed insurance salesman, in 1893. From the beginning, her relationship with his daughter was fraught with tension. Reports at the time suggest that Martha, who had once worked as a dressmaker, viewed Ida not as a stepchild, but as a rival, especially for her husband's affection and attention. On February 7, 1898, the rivalry turned lethal. That day, William came home to find a terrifying scene. His daughter Ida dead, her face disfigured with sulfuric acid, and his wife Martha unconscious in bed from what appeared to be a failed suicide attempt. She had turned on the gas in the bedroom and slit her own wrists. Investigators pieced together what had happened. Martha had thrown acid directly into Ida's face, blinding and disfiguring her. She then smothered the injured girl with a pillow. The brutality of the attack left the courtroom and public horrified. Prosecutors argued that Martha had planned the murder, possibly writing threatening letters beforehand and making preparations to eliminate the girl she viewed as an obstacle. During the trial, Martha's defense argued temporary insanity, claiming that she suffered from mental instability, worsened by a previous head injury. But the jury didn't buy it. On March 23, 1898, she was convicted of first-degree murder. Despite a flurry of last-minute appeals and letters sent to the governor pleading for clemency, her fate was sealed. Martha M. Place was transferred to Sing Sing Prison in Ossining, New York, to await her execution. Unlike male prisoners, there were no existing protocols for executing women by electric chair, so adjustments had to be made. Her physical size required modifications to the electric chair to properly restrain her. She was dressed in a long black gown, her head shaved in the back to allow better contact with the electrodes. Perhaps most disturbingly, she had to be sedated prior to execution, as she became hysterical in her final hours. Reports said she needed to be carried to the chair, too weak or unwilling to walk on her own. At 11:01 a.m. on March 20, 1899, she was led into the execution chamber. Witnesses described her face as pale and expressionless, but her eyes fixed forward with a blank stare. Guards fastened the straps tightly across her body, ensuring the electrodes made direct contact with her skin. Warden Sage gave the signal, and the current was activated. It took less than 1 minute for Martha Place to be pronounced dead. Her body jerked only slightly, and smoke curled from the metal cap. Witnesses said it was one of the most orderly executions ever carried out at Sing Sing, a disturbing contrast to the violence of the crime that brought her there. Unlike many executed prisoners who offer apologies, defiance, or spiritual closure in their final moments, Martha M. Place said nothing. According to prison staff and newspaper reporters in the witness chamber, her lips were pressed tightly shut, and she gave no indication of emotion or repentance. There were no final pleas, no prayers, and no tears. In fact, some accounts suggest that her silence was deliberate, a final act of defiance or resignation. Others speculated that the sedatives dulled her senses so completely that she wasn't fully aware of what was happening. One newspaper wrote, "She went to her death as silent as a shadow." Lena Baker, Georgia, in the deep South of the 1940s, where segregation, racism, and Jim Crow laws governed everyday life, Lena Baker's case became one of the most tragic examples of swift and unforgiving justice. Her story unfolded not in whispers or rumors, but in a small Georgia town where being poor, black, and a woman sealed her fate the moment her case began. Lena Baker was a 43-year-old African-American maid working in Cuthbert, Georgia, a rural town dominated by cotton farms and deep racial divides. She was hired to care for Ernest Knight, a white man in his 70s who owned a grist mill. Baker was a single mother of 3 and took the job out of financial necessity, unaware that it would lead her to the electric chair. What started as employment quickly turned dark. According to Baker's own testimony and limited court records, Knight was an abusive, controlling man. He reportedly forced Baker into a sexual relationship, locked her in his mill for days at a time, and threatened her with violence if she disobeyed. There were no formal protections for women like Baker, black, poor, and working in isolated conditions. On August 15, 1944, the abuse reached its fatal breaking point. That night, a confrontation occurred at the grist mill. Baker claimed she was trying to leave after another forced confinement when Knight threatened her with a metal iron bar. During the struggle, she grabbed his pistol and fired a single shot, killing him instantly. Instead of fleeing, she reported the incident immediately and turned herself in, telling police, "I shot him in self-defense. He would have killed me." Her statement, however, would mean little in the segregated court system. Within days, Baker was charged with capital murder. Her trial lasted just a single day, and the jury, 12 white men, took only minutes to convict her. She had no defense witnesses, and her court-appointed attorney made little effort to explore her claims of captivity and abuse. No records show that anyone investigated Knight's history or behavior. In September 1944, she was sentenced to death by electrocution. Lena Baker spent several months on death row at Georgia State Prison in Reedsville, a place known for its harsh conditions and isolation. Incarcerated in a segregated women's section, she awaited execution as legal appeals were filed and failed. Her sentence was temporarily stayed by Governor Ellis Arnall, who saw irregularities in the case, but after his term ended, the new governor refused clemency. Her execution was rescheduled for March 5, 1945. That morning, Baker was led from her cell to Georgia's electric chair, known as Old Sparky. Witnesses described her demeanor as calm and resigned. She had spent the previous evening in prayer with a prison chaplain, writing letters to her children and quietly preparing herself to die. Lena wore a simple prison-issued dress, her hair pressed down beneath a damp cloth to conduct electricity. She was strapped into the wooden chair by male guards, her wrists, ankles, and chest fastened tightly. Electrodes were attached to her leg and the crown of her head. The switch was thrown shortly after 11:30 a.m. The surge of electricity ended her life in seconds. Witnesses noted that the execution was carried out with cold efficiency, but the sight of a small woman, broken but dignified, dying in the chair disturbed even hardened prison staff. She was just 44 years old. Her body was removed from the chamber and later buried in an unmarked grave in Randolph County, not far from where she had lived and worked. Moments before the current was activated, Lena Baker spoke with unwavering clarity. "What I done, I did in self-defense. I am ready to meet my God." Ruth Snyder, New York. Ruth Brown Snyder lived a quiet suburban life in Queens Village, New York, with her husband Albert Snyder, an art editor at Motorboating magazine. By all appearances, they were a typical middle-class family raising a young daughter. But behind the scenes, Ruth was deeply unhappy in her marriage. She resented Albert, whom she described as cold and controlling. In 1925, Ruth began an affair with Henry Judd Gray, a corset salesman from New Jersey. Gray was meek, mild-mannered, and entirely under Ruth's spell. Together, they hatched a plan to murder her husband and collect on a life insurance policy worth $48,000, a staggering sum at the time. What made the policy even more suspicious was a forged double indemnity clause that Ruth had secretly added. On March 20th, 1927, the plan unfolded in gruesome fashion. After drugging her husband with a dose of sedatives in his evening cocktail, Ruth let Judd Gray into the house. The two then bludgeoned Albert with a window sash weight, stuffed rags soaked in chloroform into his mouth, and strangled him with picture wire. To cover their tracks, they staged the scene to look like a botched burglary, tying up Ruth and trashing the house. But the cover-up was amateurish. Detectives found inconsistencies in Ruth's story, and the supposed robbery scene seemed staged. Just hours after the murder, both she and Gray were arrested. During the sensational trial that followed, each turned on the other, blaming the other for the killing. Newspapers called it the dumbbell murder, mocking the couple's incompetence. The public was captivated. Ruth, with her blonde curls and icy demeanor, was painted as a femme fatale, while Gray was seen as her spineless pawn. After a highly publicized trial, both were convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Ruth Snyder was transferred to Sing Sing Prison, where she waited for nearly a year on death row. Her appeals failed. Despite being the first woman to be executed in New York since Martha Place in 1899, there was no delay in carrying out her sentence. She was scheduled to die on the same night as her co-conspirator, Judd Gray. On January 12, 1928, she was led to the death chamber. Ruth had maintained her innocence to the end, but by that morning she seemed resigned. Dressed in a simple prison outfit with her hair pulled back, she was visibly trembling. Witnesses described her whispering faintly to herself, possibly a prayer or incoherent murmuring, while being strapped into the chair. The electric chair at Sing Sing had already claimed dozens of lives. Ruth became one of the few women to die in it. What made her execution infamous, however, wasn't just the crime, it was the photograph. A reporter for the New York Daily News, Tom Howard, had smuggled a miniature camera strapped to his ankle. At the exact moment the current hit Ruth Snyder, he triggered the shutter. The grainy black and white photo showed her body arched in the chair, a strap over her face, as electricity surged through her. The next day, the image ran on the front page of the Daily News under the headline, "Dead." It became one of the most iconic and controversial crime photos in American journalism, sparking national outrage and debate about ethics, the death penalty, and media sensationalism. Ruth Snyder offered no final statement. Her lips moved slightly as she was secured in the chair, but her words were inaudible, lost beneath the hum of the electric equipment and the murmurs of the witnesses. One prison official described her as looking terrified, like a woman trying to pray but unable to find the words. Others claimed she was mumbling something under her breath, but no one could confirm what it was. Her silence stood in stark contrast to the media storm surrounding her case. Within seconds of the current being applied, her body jolted violently. The execution was completed quickly. Her body was removed, and the next prisoner, Judd Gray, was brought in shortly after. He too died in the chair the same night. Anna Marie Hahn, Ohio. Anna Marie Hahn arrived in the United States from Germany in the late 1920s, claiming to be a widowed doctor's wife. She settled in Cincinnati, Ohio, where she quickly made a name for herself in the German immigrant community. On the surface, Anna was a charming and respectable woman, a wife, a mother, and a caregiver for the elderly. But beneath that warm exterior lay a woman driven by greed, manipulation, and cold calculation. Between 1933 and 1937, Hahn gained the trust of elderly German men living alone. She offered them companionship, care, and attention, often moving into their homes under the guise of nursing them through their declining health. In reality, she was orchestrating their slow and painful deaths, administering arsenic and other poisons in their food, drinks, and medicine. Her known victims included Ernst Kohler, whose death raised early suspicions, Albert Parker, whose estate she attempted to claim, George Heiss, a bakery owner found with large doses of poison in his body, Jacob Wagner, who left behind a will naming Hahn as beneficiary, and George Obendorfer, a man she traveled with to Colorado where he suddenly collapsed and died. Each victim was elderly, wealthy, and alone, and many of them signed over money, property, or life insurance to Hahn shortly before their mysterious deaths. She forged documents, drained bank accounts, and told conflicting stories to families and doctors alike. It was the death of George Obendorfer in 1937 that finally unraveled her web of deceit. Authorities in Colorado discovered massive arsenic levels in his system and opened a full investigation. Soon, suspicions grew around the string of other deaths linked to Anna. Exhumations revealed poison in multiple victims' bodies, and Hahn was arrested and charged with murder. Her trial was swift, but nationally covered. Reporters dubbed her the Blonde Borgia, likening her to the infamous Renaissance-era poisoner Lucrezia Borgia. The courtroom was packed, and the public followed every development as shocking details of the murders came to light. Anna Hahn maintained her innocence, insisting she had loved and cared for the men. But the evidence was overwhelming. In November 1937, she was convicted of the murder of Jacob Wagner, and though she was suspected in several other killings, she was sentenced to death for just that one. Anna Marie Hahn was transferred to Ohio Penitentiary in Columbus, where she was housed in a special section for female prisoners. She spent over a year on death row while appeals were processed and ultimately denied. As her execution date approached, Anna's outward demeanor remained calm and cooperative. She received visits from her family, especially her young son Oscar, whom she reportedly adored. She spent her last days writing letters, praying, and preparing for death. On the morning of December 7, 1938, Anna was awakened early and given her final rites by a Catholic priest. She dressed neatly and calmly, speaking briefly with guards who later described her as soft-spoken and dignified. She was escorted into the execution chamber housing Ohio's electric chair, nicknamed Old Sparky. The room was sterile, quiet, and filled with a small group of witnesses. As she entered, Anna reportedly glanced around the room without fear, then sat down slowly in the chair. Executioners fastened leather straps across her body, securing her arms, legs, and torso. A metal cap with a damp sponge was placed on her head. Her golden blonde hair had been partially shaved to allow for the electrode. The room went still as the warden gave the signal. Just before the current was activated, Anna Hahn turned to the warden and the guards. Her final words were clear and calm. "I want to thank the warden and the guards for all they have done for me. I am ready to die." There was no sign of panic, no cries for mercy, only a composed farewell from a woman who had once sweet-talked elderly men into trusting her with their lives. Moments later, the switch was thrown. High-voltage current surged through her body, and her execution was completed in just over 1 minute. At 8:13 a.m., Anna Marie Hahn was pronounced dead. She was 32 years old. Her body was later claimed by family and buried in Cincinnati's Vine Street Hill Cemetery. Mary Frances Creighton, New York. Mary Frances Creighton's story is one of calculated manipulation, cloaked in maternal devotion. Her crimes spanned nearly a decade, involving multiple poisonings, but it was the death of her own daughter-in-law, a teenage bride, that finally led her to the electric chair. Born in 1899, Mary Frances Creighton lived a seemingly ordinary life in Long Island, New York. But underneath the surface, she harbored a deeply disturbing obsession, her possessive attachment to her son, Robert Creighton. By the early 1930s, Robert was in his late teens and had fallen in love with and married Adelaide Blanche, an 18-year-old girl who had just entered the Creighton household. Mary saw Adelaide not as a welcome addition to the family, but as a rival for her son's affection. Over time, tensions grew in the home, with Mary reportedly expressing jealousy and disgust toward Adelaide. Friends and neighbors later testified that Mary's control over Robert was unnaturally intense, and that she resented any woman who came between them. On October 1st, 1935, Adelaide fell violently ill after dinner. She suffered from agonizing stomach pains, vomiting, and convulsions, all symptoms consistent with arsenic poisoning. Within hours, she was dead. An autopsy revealed high levels of arsenic in her system. Authorities immediately turned their attention to Mary, who had a long and suspicious history involving sudden deaths in her household. Years earlier, she had been suspected in the poisoning of her own brother, Raymond Avery, and even her father-in-law. But in those cases, evidence was circumstantial and charges never stuck. In this case, investigators uncovered damning testimony. Mary had allegedly conspired with a man named Everett Applegate, her secret lover and former Navy radio man. Prosecutors claimed the two had plotted to poison Adelaide to remove her from the household and allow Mary to reclaim control over her son. Witnesses also stated that Mary had access to arsenic and had used it in the household before. In April 1936, Mary and Applegate were both convicted of first-degree murder. The jury was convinced not only by the toxicology results, but also by the disturbing psychology of the case. The court saw Mary not as a desperate mother, but as a woman who would rather kill than relinquish her influence over her son. After sentencing, Mary Frances Creighton was sent to Sing Sing prison, where she was housed in the women's block and placed under suicide watch. Despite the media storm around her case, she reportedly kept a cold, emotionless demeanor, rarely showing remorse or fear. On July 16, 1936, just a few months after her conviction, she was scheduled for execution alongside her co-defendant, Everett Applegate. The double execution drew significant media attention, not just because of the crime, but because it was rare for a woman to be electrocuted. Mary was the first woman executed in New York since Ruth Snyder in 1928. Unlike Snyder, however, there were no hidden cameras this time, just a silent procession of guards and witnesses. Because of Mary's slim, petite frame, executioners took special precautions. Additional restraints were used to secure her body tightly to the wooden chair. She was dressed in a plain black dress, her ankles and wrists strapped down, and a moist cloth placed under the electrode on her shaved scalp. Witnesses described the moment as cold and methodical. She offered no resistance, no final outburst. She sat stiffly, her head down slightly, eyes barely lifted. The warden gave the signal, and the current was applied. As she was being strapped in, Mary turned her head slightly and whispered to the warden, "I have nothing to say. May God have mercy." Those were her final words. No apology, no justification, just a quiet, trembling request for divine pity. Seconds later, the power surged through her body. The room was silent but for the hiss of electricity and the mechanical buzz of the current. In under a minute, Mary Frances Creighton was dead, followed shortly after by Everett Applegate, who met the same fate. She was 37 years old. Her body was later removed for burial, and the press moved on quickly, as they always did. But her story of maternal obsession, arsenic, and death remains one of the most unsettling in the history of female executions in the United States. Virginia Christian, Virginia. Virginia Christian's case is as tragic as it is historic. At just 17 years old, she became the only female juvenile ever executed in the state of Virginia, and the only woman to die in Virginia's electric chair. Her story took place in the shadow of the Jim Crow South, where justice for a black teenager was swift, unforgiving, and final. Virginia Christian worked as a domestic servant for a white woman named Ida Belote in Hampton, Virginia. The year was 1912, and Christian, a black teenager from a poor family, had little power or protection in a deeply segregated society. According to court records and testimonies, the relationship between Virginia and her employer was volatile and abusive. Belote was described as irritable, cruel, and quick to anger, especially toward her young maid. On March 18, 1912, during what Christian described as a particularly harsh exchange, an argument escalated into violence. Christian claimed that Belote struck her and threatened to have her arrested over a minor dispute, allegedly over a missing hand towel. In a fit of rage and self-defense, Christian retaliated. She struck Belote with a broom handle, then with an ironing board. Reports say she also shoved a towel into her employer's mouth to stop her from screaming. Belote died shortly after from the assault, her body found in the home by neighbors who had grown suspicious when she didn't answer the door. Virginia fled the scene, but was quickly arrested. She confessed to the attack, but insisted she had acted out of desperation and fear. She had no legal counsel at the time of her confession, and her account of the events received little scrutiny in a system that offered no presumption of innocence to a poor black teenager accused of killing a white woman. Charged with first-degree murder, Virginia's trial was conducted quickly. An all-white, all-male jury convicted her within hours, and the judge sentenced her to death by electrocution. She was not yet 18 years old. Virginia was sent to the state penitentiary in Richmond, Virginia, to await her execution. Public appeals were made to Governor William Mann, urging him to grant clemency due to her young age, the abusive environment, and her lack of legal representation. Letters came from local citizens, clergy, and black community leaders. But the governor refused to intervene, stating that justice had been served. Preparations were made for her execution on August 16, 1912. On the morning of her death, Virginia was calm and composed. She had spent her final days in prayer and had been visited by ministers who later described her as deeply remorseful, but spiritually at peace. Dressed in a plain prison garment, her wrists were tied, and she was led into the death chamber. barely tall enough to sit properly in the electric chair. Because she was so young and small, adjustments had to be made to the chair to ensure proper fit and contact. Witnesses noted how surreal it looked. A teenage girl being strapped into a device designed for adult men, surrounded by prison officials and onlookers. The room was quiet. No family was present. As the final moments approached, Virginia looked up and spoke softly. "I am ready to die. I have made peace with God." Those were the last words she ever spoke. With no trace of fear in her voice, she met her fate not with defiance or tears, but with a startling stillness for someone so young. At 7:45 a.m., the switch was thrown. Electricity surged through her body, and within moments, she was pronounced dead. Witnesses described the execution as quick, though several were visibly shaken by the sight of a girl, barely old enough to vote or marry, dying in the electric chair. Velma Barfield, North Carolina. Born Margie Velma Bullard in 1932 in rural North Carolina, Velma endured a troubled childhood marked by alleged abuse, strict discipline, and early signs of psychological distress. She married young, but her personal life was plagued by instability, drug dependency, and suspicious tragedies. Her criminal journey began in the 1970s, after a series of family members and acquaintances began dying under mysterious circumstances. All of them had one thing in common. Velma was their caregiver. Though she was convicted of only one murder, that of her fiancé Stuart Taylor in 1978, the full scope of her crimes unfolded after her arrest. Velma had slipped arsenic-based rat poison into Stuart's beer and food, causing a slow, agonizing death that mimicked illness. An autopsy confirmed high levels of arsenic in his system, prompting investigators to reopen other deaths in her orbit. She ultimately confessed to 6 murders, including her mother, Lillian Bullard, poisoned with arsenic-laced food; 2 elderly patients she cared for, Dolly Edwards and Jenny Lee Burke; her boyfriend Stuart Taylor; her husband Thomas Burke, who died under suspicious circumstances years earlier. Despite the horrifying list, Velma often maintained a composed, even devout persona. Behind bars, she became a born-again Christian, ministering to other inmates and writing letters to victims' families. Her transformation prompted some, including religious leaders, to call for clemency. But the courts and state officials were not moved. In 1984, after 6 years on death row, the state of North Carolina set her execution date. Velma was transferred to Central Prison in Raleigh, where North Carolina housed its death row inmates. She was 52 years old, the first woman sentenced to die in the state since 1962, and the first woman in the nation to be scheduled for execution after the U.S. Supreme Court reinstated the death penalty in 1976. Despite pleas from her attorneys, anti-death penalty advocates, and even televangelist Billy Graham, her appeals were denied. On the night of November 1st, 1984, Velma reportedly remained calm. She read from the Bible, prayed, and met with spiritual advisors. That evening she was given her last meal, cheese doodles and a Coca-Cola. A simple choice for a woman whose crimes were anything but. In the early hours of November 2nd, she was led to North Carolina's electric chair. Dressed in light-colored prison clothes, she walked unaided into the chamber. Witnesses described her as composed, serene, and at peace. Strapped into the chair, her body was secured with thick leather restraints across her wrists, ankles, chest, and forehead. Electrodes were attached to her head and right leg. A damp sponge was placed beneath the skull cap to aid conductivity. The witnesses in the chamber fell silent. Before the switch was thrown, Velma Barfield looked up and spoke softly but clearly. "I'm sorry for all the hurt I've caused. I want to thank everyone who's been kind to me. I'm at peace." It was the final statement of a woman who had spent years wearing 2 faces, the devoted Christian and the serial poisoner. There was no denial, no last-minute declaration of innocence, just a quiet acknowledgement of her crimes and the people she'd wronged. At 2:15 a.m., the electric current surged through her body. Witnesses said she showed little physical movement. After 2 cycles of electricity, she was pronounced dead. Velma Barfield became the first woman executed in the United States in over 20 years, and a lasting figure in the national conversation about crime, justice, and redemption. She was buried in a private ceremony, her grave marked only by a small headstone in her hometown. But her story, of Southern charm, cold-blooded murder, and a final prayer, remains one of the most unsettling in American criminal history. Judy Buenoano, Florida. Judy Buenoano earned the nickname the Black Widow for a chilling reason. Everyone close to her seemed to die mysteriously, and each death left her richer. Over 2 decades, she quietly orchestrated the deaths of her husband, her son, and her fiancé, staging each as either an accident or natural cause. But behind the facade of a grieving mother and widow was a woman coldly manipulating life insurance policies, poison, and explosives. Born Julius Welty in 1943, Judy Buenoano lived a life marked by early trauma and abuse, which later gave way to a path of premeditated violence and manipulation. Her criminal activities began in earnest in the early 1970s, targeting the people who trusted her the most. In 1971, her husband, James Goodyear, a U.S. Air Force sergeant, suddenly died after returning home from Vietnam. His death was initially ruled natural, but years later, investigators found he had been slowly poisoned with arsenic, a substance Judy had been slipping into his meals over time. She collected on his life insurance policy and moved on with her life. Just a few years later, Judy's teenage son, Michael Goodyear, fell ill under equally suspicious circumstances. In 1980, while suffering from unexplained neurological symptoms, Michael was forced to wear heavy leg braces. Judy took him canoeing in a river near Pensacola, Florida. The canoe mysteriously capsized, and Michael, unable to swim or remove his braces, drowned. She again collected life insurance money, cashing in on another tragedy she engineered. But her crimes didn't end there. Judy also poisoned and killed her fiancé John Gentry in 1983, this time by planting a car bomb. Gentry survived the explosion and told police that Judy had been giving him vitamin pills that had made him sick in the months leading up to the bombing. Forensic testing later revealed the pills contained arsenic and paraformaldehyde. Her arrest and conviction followed quickly. The investigation uncovered a pattern of calculated murders for profit, with evidence that Judy had poisoned multiple men in her life and attempted to murder others using elaborate schemes. In 1984, she was convicted of first-degree murder in the death of Michael, and later received convictions for the murder of her husband and the attempted murder of her fiancé. Her methods ranged from arsenic poisoning to drowning to car bombing, earning her the dark reputation as one of the most versatile and dangerous female serial killers in U.S. history. After nearly 14 years of appeals and legal challenges, her execution was scheduled for March 30, 1998. Judy Buenoano was incarcerated on Florida's death row for women at Florida State Prison, where she waited for over a decade. She was the first woman executed in Florida since 1848, and her case drew national attention as reporters and true crime enthusiasts followed the countdown to her death. The method chosen was the electric chair, notoriously known as Old Sparky. The same chair had been used for decades to execute hundreds of Florida inmates, and it carried with it a brutal reputation. On the night before her execution, Judy reportedly spent her final hours quietly. She met with a spiritual advisor, wrote a few letters, and chose her last meal: broccoli, asparagus, strawberries, and hot tea. It was a small, seemingly health-conscious selection, ironic given her history of poisoning food to kill. At 7 a.m. on March 30, 1998, Judy was led into the execution chamber. She wore a long dark blue dress and flats. Her demeanor was described by witnesses as calm, composed, and expressionless. She offered no final words, choosing instead to sit silently as prison staff prepared her for execution. Her body was strapped into Old Sparky with thick leather belts across her arms, legs, chest, and forehead. Electrodes were attached to her shaved leg and scalp. A damp sponge was placed under the headpiece to ensure conductivity. As the final moment approached, witnesses reported that Judy stared directly ahead, her eyes fixed on the wall. She did not speak, weep, or pray. Judy declined to make a final statement. The room remained tense and quiet as the executioner flipped the switch. Within seconds, high voltage surged through her body. Her fists clenched and her torso jerked slightly against the restraints. After 2 surges of electricity, a doctor examined her and pronounced her dead at 7:13 a.m. She was 54 years old. Her execution was the culmination of a deadly career fueled by greed, manipulation, and cold-blooded murder. Despite years of media coverage, Judy Buenoano never showed remorse and never offered a confession beyond what was already proven. Her silence in death mirrored the cold precision of her crimes and ensured that the last image the public saw of her was one of eerie composure in the face of judgment. Women make up a very small percentage of those executed in the U.S., and even fewer have faced the electric chair. Their stories are chilling, not only for their crimes, but also for how society viewed female killers. The electric chair, with its searing voltage and brutality, left behind a trail of mystery, controversy, and cold silence. If you found these stories as haunting as we did, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more real crime stories from America's dark past. Which story disturbed you the most? Let us know in the comments. And remember, every case leaves behind a legacy far deeper than the headlines. Thanks for watching. Until next time, stay safe and stay curious.